Good morning, students. Today, let me start a new chapter, that is respiration, particularly about human respiration. And this chapter is very important at this time of COVID pandemic situation. The reason is, this COVID-19 disease, or what we call it as corona disease, it is affecting the human respiratory system. Before going into the details of this respiration mechanism, let me refresh your memories about the anatomy of the human respiratory system. And as you observe in this slide, the human respiratory system, it starts with the nose, the external visible part of the respiratory system, and that leads to pharynx, and that pharynx, it leads to larynx, that is the voice box, and that larynx leads to a tube what is called as windpipe, or technically known as trachea, and after that leads to a component what is called bronchus, and that bronchus divides into two, that is right bronchus and the left bronchus. And this bronchus, it leads to the respective lungs. So right bronchus enters into right lung and left bronchus enters into left lung. And after it penetrates into the lung, the respective lung, it divides into the first order branches called primary bronchioles. Primary bronchioles divides to produce many branches called secondary bronchioles. Secondary bronchioles leads to tertiary bronchioles, and tertiary bronchioles leads to respiratory bronchioles, and respiratory bronchioles are ending up with the components or the units of the human respiratory system called alveoli, which you have already studied in your PU classes. And this whole respiratory system, that is the inner part of the respiratory system, what we call it otherwise as the lower part of the respiratory system, that is enclosed within a chest cavity or the thoracic cavity, and externally it is having the skeletal support of the rib cage, and below which there is a muscular dome-shaped projection what is known as diaphragm. And this diaphragm, it plays a very important role in the process of breathing, either to increase the chest volume or the lung volume, or to decrease the same. So this is what the brief introduction about the human respiratory system. I need not go to the details of this respiratory part, especially the anatomy part of this respiratory system. Next is about the components of the lower respiratory tract, or the lower respiratory part. And as I already told you that trachea, the windpipe, it leads to a structure what is called as bronchus, and this is what the right bronchus which enters the right lung, and this is what the left bronchus which enters the left lung. And these lungs are being covered out by a membrane what is called as pleura, which is further subdivided into two sublayers like outer parietal pleura and inner visceral pleura. And between these two pleural layers there is a space called pleural space, and that is being filled with a fluid called pleural fluid, which plays an important role in the process of breathing, as well as it provides the lubrication for the expansion and the contraction of the lung volume. And the right lung, it is said to be placed a bit in a higher position when compared to the left lung, and it is having the following lobes, that is the right upper lobe, the right middle lobe, and the right lower lobe. And the left lung, it is having the subdivisions like left upper lobe, left lower lobe, and left middle lobe actually. So these are the anatomical features of this lungs, the human lungs. Coming to the respiratory tree divisions, as I already told you that the trachea leads to the branch called the bronchiole, the bronchus, and that bronchus, as it is a collapsible type of tube, it is being supported by some C-shaped cartilaginous rings. And this human lung, as I already explained to you, that this right bronchus and as well as left bronchus, it after penetrates the respective lung, it divides to produce the anastomosing branches, wherein the first order branches are called primary bronchioles, as you can see here, and primary bronchioles leads to secondary bronchioles, secondary to tertiary, and tertiary to the respiratory bronchioles, and respiratory bronchioles leads to alveolar duct, and alveolar duct leads to alveolar sacs. And it is roughly estimated that in each lung there are about 300 to 350 million alveoli are there. You just imagine how small they are. And these are the structural and functional units of the human lungs, or in all vertebrate lungs for that matter. Coming to the structure of alveolus or the alveoli. This is what the actual respiratory zone, what we call it otherwise as, because they are the actual ones which are involved in the exchange of respiratory gases. And here you can make out that detailed structure of this alveolus. So respiratory bronchioles, the last order of branching of the bronchiole, that leads to alveolar duct, and alveolar duct leads to the alveoli, the small grape-like structures as you see in this slide. Those are the structural and functional units of the lungs. And many alveoli are clustered together to form a single alveolar sac, as you observe here. And these alveoli are said to be highly vascularized, that is, they are supplied with rich blood vessels, both capillaries, arteries and veins are there around this alveoli. So this is what the anatomical part of this human respiratory system in brief. Now let us go through the detailed mechanism of respiration. What is respiration? Normally if you ask this question to a normal person, the person says like this: respiration is nothing but the process of taking in air and giving out air, or the process of taking in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide. But that is actually the mechanism of breathing or pulmonary ventilation. Then what actually this respiration is? Respiration is a complex physiological process of taking in of oxygen, using it in the process of metabolism of food materials in the tissues to derive energy, and the elimination of metabolic waste, namely the carbon dioxide, and the respiratory process may be of the different types. So it is not only the taking in of oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide, but also utilizing that absorbed or the inhaled oxygen for the process called metabolism, which occurs inside the mitochondria of each and every cell of our body for the liberation of the ATPs, that is the metabolic energy. So this whole process is actually the respiration. And let us go through some of the types of respiration which we already studied. The first one being aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration, as the name itself suggests, it is the process of using free environmental oxygen to metabolism, and through this method a molecule of glucose yields about 38 ATPs, and carbon dioxide and water are produced as waste. And this type of respiration is seen in all higher plants and animals. The next type will be anaerobic respiration. It is a metabolism in the absence of oxygen, and through this method a molecule of glucose yields 2 ATPs only. So there is a huge gap is there in terms of the ATP production between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So in aerobic, 38 ATPs are produced from one molecule of glucose, whereas only 2 ATPs are produced in aerobic respiration. And here the end products are, the byproducts are carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. And this method is also called fermentation, and it occurs in organisms like bacteria, yeast, and some intestinal parasites. Coming to next type, direct respiration. Oxygen and carbon dioxide being transported directly to and from the tissues without the medium of blood. So this is seen in those animals which do not have a proper respiratory system. And this is seen in protozoans, sponges, coelentrates, flatworms, and insects. Then the next type will be indirect respiration. Oxygen and carbon dioxide being transported through the medium of blood, and this type of respiration is seen in annelids, molluscans, chordates, etc. Coming to the next type, external respiration. It is actually the external and internal respiration, the next two types, they are actually coming under aerobic respiration. Let us go through external respiration. It is the exchange of gases between the environment and the blood, and it is also called the pulmonary respiration or breathing or pulmonary ventilation. It is called pulmonary ventilation because the ventilation of the lungs, that is the pulmonary region, happens, and that is why it is called pulmonary ventilation. Next type will be internal respiration. It is the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues, and it is also called the tissue or cellular respiration. So this is an introductory part about respiration mechanism. Now let us go through the details of external respiration. It is the oxygen movement into the blood, and the alveoli always has more oxygen than the blood, and the oxygen moves by diffusion towards the area of lower concentration, and pulmonary capillary blood gains oxygen. So in other words, this external respiration, it is the process of inhalation, that is the inhalation of oxygen from the respiratory system, and that it gains the oxygen supply from the atmospheric air. You know, the atmospheric air is a combination of several gases, and one of such gases will be oxygen, which is required for our body cells. And the pressure that is exerted by all these gases of the atmosphere are said to be the total atmospheric pressure, and normally it will be about 730 mm of Hg. And as it is a mixture of several such gases, the amount of pressure exerted by the oxygen alone, it is roughly around 40 to 45 mm of Hg, and that is what referred to as partial pressure of oxygen. Why I said about this partial pressure of oxygen is that this partial pressure of oxygen, it varies from one part of the respiratory system to the other part. And when we inhale the air, that is oxygen, there will be high pressure of that partial pressure of that oxygen, and when it reaches the lungs, that is the alveolus, it is said to be slightly lesser. And that oxygen which is present in the alveoli, it diffuses into the surrounding capillary blood, and that blood will carry that oxygen through hemoglobin, and the same is being supplied to all body cells, and the body cells will always be in a demand for that oxygen. So there is a gradual decline in the partial pressure of this oxygen is seen at the time of transportation of oxygen. So that you should remember always, which always works on the principles of Boyle's law. You know, you have studied about Boyle's law already in your PU classes, and This Boyle's law states that at standard temperature conditions, the pressure of the oxygen or the partial pressure of a particular gas, it gradually declines, and it is always moving from a region of higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. Next is continuation of this external respiration. The carbon dioxide movement out of the blood is also said to be external respiration, and the blood returning from the tissues has higher concentrations of oxygen than that of the air in the alveoli. It is quite obvious because once the cells utilize the oxygen, they will produce carbon dioxide as a waste product, that is byproduct, and that carbon dioxide should exhale from the body, and that again returns to the same blood, and the blood is carrying that carbon dioxide in different forms that I will explain you in detail later. And that carbon dioxide, once it reaches the alveolar level, that carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillary blood into alveoli, and that is being sent out of the body during exhalation or expiration. And the blood leaving the lungs is oxygen rich and carbon dioxide poor, whereas the air that is leaving the lungs, it is carbon dioxide rich and oxygen poor. That means when we inhale, we not only take the oxygen alone, but we take some other gases also which are present in the atmosphere. That is why when we inhale the atmospheric oxygen in atmospheric air in a polluted area, we may inhale some pollutants too. So also with reference to the exhalation process, when we exhale, we do not exhale only the carbon dioxide, but along with that, some other gases which might have entered into the human system during inhalation, they will also be moving. But we are concentrating more on the movements of oxygen and carbon dioxide here because those are the two chief respiratory gases. Coming to gas transport in the blood, and oxygen gets transported in the blood, and inside red blood cells they are attached to the hemoglobin molecule, which are the chief carrier of that oxygen, and very small negligible amount of oxygen is carried in the dissolved condition in the plasma. So that is what's shown here. And coming to the gas transport in the blood continuation, the carbon dioxide is also being transported in the blood, and most of it is transported into the in the plasma as bicarbonate ions, that is HCO3 minus ions, and a very small amount is carried inside the blood cells on hemoglobin. So this hemoglobin, it is very interesting to note here that it not only carries oxygen, but it also carries some amount of carbon dioxide too. So it is a carrier for both oxygen as well as carbon dioxide, the chief respiratory gases. So from one end it is carrying, the hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, and from the other end, that is from the cellular end, it carries the carbon dioxide. So this picture will show you the detailed mechanism of the respiratory gases exchange. And as you observe here, this is the structure of a single alveolus, wherein this is what the capillaries that are found surrounding the alveolus, and they will contain the capillary blood in them, and these are the epithelial cells of that capillaries. And here what you can observe is that this oxygen which is there in that capillary blood, it enters from the alveolar cavity. Inside each and every alveolus there will be a space, and that alveolus has received the oxygen when we inhale. So that movement of oxygen is being shown in the red colored arrow marks, whereas the movement of carbon dioxide is shown in blue color. So this oxygen which is there in the alveolar space, that will enter the capillary blood through the mechanism of diffusion only. And so also the carbon dioxide which are there in rich amounts in the capillary blood, they will enter the alveolar space again through the mechanism of diffusion. So one particular route in each and every alveolus there will be the movement of oxygen, and in the other route or the opposite route there is always the movement of carbon dioxide is seen. So it is said to be never empty. Coming to the detailed mechanism of breathing, it is also called the pulmonary ventilation, as I said, or also called external respiration, and it is the entry of oxygen from the environment into the blood and the exit of carbon dioxide from the blood to the environment, and it involves two steps, namely the inspiration and expiration. What is inspiration? It is also called inhalation, and it is an active process involving the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. What are intercostal muscles? These are some specialized muscles or the musculature that is found between the these rib cages. You know rib cages? Rib cage is a skeletal component which protects this soft organs called lungs. And there are two such types of intercostal muscles are there, like external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles. And under the nervous stimulation, that is phrenic nerve, which is the major nerve which is involved in controlling the respiration process, and under its stimulation the dome-shaped diaphragm becomes flattened. The question arises here, why it becomes flattened? You know, diaphragm is it is a muscular structure made up of skeletal muscles, and the contractions of such skeletal muscles makes this the original dome-shaped diaphragm to become flattened, and because of that the process of breathing is allowed, either the expansion or the contraction. So when the diaphragm is flattened and the intercostal muscles contract, the lung volume gets expanded. That means it can accommodate more amount of air, and the ribs and the sternum move upward and forward, so that there will be the more increase in the chest cavity is seen in terms of its volume, and the air from outside rushes into the alveoli, and the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. So all these things will happen during the process of inspiration or inhalation. Coming to expiration, it is also called exhalation. It is a passive process wherein the inspiration is an active process and this is an passive process. The diaphragm returns to its original dome shape. You know, when diaphragm assumes its original dome shape, the lungs are under compression. So also the intercostal muscles relax. So if the intercostal muscles of the rib cage they relax, the lungs will be under compression. That means the volume of the air that it can accommodate becomes lesser. So under this the lungs are under compression, because of which the air which is present inside the alveoli or the lungs are in a pressure or in a force or a state to exhale that air what is present in them. So the volume inside the chest cavity is reduced and the pressure increases. So because of which the carbon dioxide rich air from the alveoli flows out gradually. So this happens during expiration. So one thing is very clear now, that during the process of inspiration or inhalation, the diaphragm assumes flattened shape almost, and that is aided by the contractions of the skeletal muscles of the diaphragm as well as the contractions of the intercostal muscles of the rib cage. So the lung volume is increased. That is what you can make out here. Whereas during expiration, the muscles, that is the external and internal intercostal muscles of the diaphragm, the rib cage, they are under compression, and the diaphragm gets its original dome shape because of the relaxations of those skeletal muscles of the diaphragm, because of which it assumes dome shape and it pushes the lungs upwards. So there will be the pressure on the lungs both upwards, downwards and sidewards, because of which the lung volume gets reduced. And under such a situation, the air rushes outside. That is, the air which is rich in carbon dioxide moves out of the lungs through these nostrils of the nose. Whereas the reverse is happening in inspiration. So this diagram will clearly explain you how that inspiration and expiration happens during the mechanism of or the process of breathing. Coming to the respiratory pigments. These respiratory gases are moving in our blood, because blood is the main vehicle which carries both these respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, which I already told you in one of my previous slides. So this blood alone, it cannot carry that oxygen and carbon dioxide. The blood itself cannot carries the respiratory gases, but contains a respiratory pigment which actually act as the carrier of the respiratory gases, because the pigment has a special affinity for respiratory gases. In our blood there will be the RBCs, and the number of RBCs is more when compared to WBCs, and each RBC contains, a mature RBC contains hemoglobin in it, which is the chief carrier for that oxygen, and as well as it carries carbon dioxide too. So that respiratory pigment plays an important role in the transportation of respiratory gases, not only in human individuals but also in other animals which have blood as the chief vehicle for transportation of respiratory gases. And in all these animals, these respiratory pigments play a very important role in the transportation of respiratory gases. So that is what the significance of studying about this topic, respiratory pigments. The respiratory pigment in its nature varies in different animals, and respiratory pigment differ also in their chemical constitution in different groups of animals, and even in the same phylum or the phyla there may be several types of pigments too. And these pigments include the cytochromes, the flavoprotein and other colored molecules of protein called chromoprotein, which are the significance in the transportation of respiratory gases, which will impart or definite color to the body fluids like blood. Coming to the definition, a respiratory pigment is a molecule such as hemoglobin in invertebrates as well as in vertebrates that increases the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Or respiratory pigments are colored substances present in the blood transporting the oxygen and carbon dioxide. Or respiratory pigments are the circulatory pigments which will mediate the transfer of respiratory gases at the extracellular and intracellular level. So these are the different definitions for this respiratory pigments. Coming to the characteristics of respiratory pigments, they are colored pigments. They are colored pigments and they have special affinities for respiratory gases, and they are described either in the blood, distributed either in the blood or in the body or in body fluids. And they are always colored proteins which contain a metallic ion in them, and they combines with oxygen and carbon dioxide and play a key role in the transportation of such respiratory gases. Now let us continue our discussion about the different respiratory pigments. First, let me start with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin occurs in the blood plasma of invertebrates, and it is also called erythrochrorin by some authors. And it is a chromoprotein, that is a conjugated protein, and it is found in few holothurians of echinodermata and several crustaceans and chironomous insect of arthropoda and planorbis, annelids and parasitic nematodes, flatworms, etc. And it has a molecular weight of around 68,000 kilodaltons. It is red in color because of the metallic group present in it called iron. So iron is very essential for our respiration process, especially for the transportation of respiratory gases, that we have already discussed under digestion chapter about the significance of iron. Coming to chemical structure, hemoglobin is a conjugated protein which is composed of two components, namely a protein component, what is known as globin, and a non-protein component called heme. And the globin is formed of 4 polypeptide chains. Of the 4, 2 are identical and are called alpha chains, and each alpha chain is formed of 141 amino acids, and the other 2 identical chains are beta chains, which contain about 146 number of amino acids in it. So a hemoglobin, especially the globin part with the protein part, it contains 4 polypeptide chains in it, wherein 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains are there. And the heme is formed of iron and porphyrin, and the iron is present in the ferrous form, whereas the porphyrin is the pigment and it gives red color to the hemoglobin. There are 4 heme molecules in one hemoglobin molecule, which is very significant here because each heme group can carry 1 molecule of oxygen. So a hemoglobin molecule can carry about 4 oxygen molecules at a time. So this is the elaborate structure of hemoglobin, wherein you can see alpha chain here and a beta chain, and these alpha and beta chains are shown in different colors here. That's what you can make out. And this is what the beta chain, and this is what alpha chain, and between alpha and beta chain you will be observing a heme group in between them, or a metallic group is associated with them, which binds these 4 polypeptide chains firmly. Coming to the function of hemoglobin, hemoglobin combines with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin, a reversible compound, and this combination is loose once it reaches the cellular level. That is, at low oxygen pressure it leaves the oxygen and for reduced hemoglobin. At the high oxygen pressure it combines oxygen, that it happens at the alveolar level, and form oxygenated hemoglobin or the oxidized hemoglobin. And one hemoglobin molecule, as I said earlier, it can bind with 4 oxygen molecules because there are 4 heme groups in a hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin has the ability to combine reversibly with oxygen. As I said earlier, that this oxyhemoglobin is not a stable compound, it's an highly unstable or reversible compound. And in invertebrates, the function of hemoglobin is interesting. That is, in some invertebrates, hemoglobin transport oxygen at atmospheric pressure, wherein in others at low pressure. And in some invertebrates, the hemoglobin store oxygen during hypoxia condition, that is the low oxygen levels. So this is all about hemoglobin, one of the main respiratory pigment seen in some invertebrates and all vertebrate animals. and let us continue our discussion in next class with other respiratory pigments. Thank you.